Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to, let's say, Waterloo, Ontario, and Victoria in British Columbia, and Ann Arbor in Michigan. How about that? This is one of those schmooze days where I never tell people what to talk about. We find out what we're all interested in. And I think today we're for sure going to have a conversation about some aspect of peace work because all of the panelists are people who have done and are still very engaged with peace work. So let me start with Alan Haber, who arrived first. He's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we've just been talking about the fact that he was the first president of SDS back in the 60s, Students for Democratic Society. And he's imagined being an activist all these years. He says now it's SDS stands for Seniors for Democratic Society and Sisters for Democratic Society. And I'm invited to join. So hello, Alan. Nice to see you.
Nice, good to be here.
Good. Okay, then Jonathan Down is in Victoria, British Columbia. Jonathan is a pediatrician, not just an ordinary pediatrician. He specializes in children with neurological diseases, I believe. He is the current president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada branch. So good morning, Jonathan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. I love your T-shirt. Physicians, what does the rest say?
It says Physicians for Global Survival. We changed our name to International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the Canadian affiliate, and we've expanded our purposes as well. So, in many ways, we are in a situation for global survival.
Good morning, Neil Arya. Neil is also a physician, and he's also very much involved with the Canadian branch of the IPPNW. Neil, I want you to tell us what you didn't have a chance to say just a few seconds ago, because you say you've just been in a meeting dealing with refugee health issues and so on. Can you tell us what you're up to?
Yeah, we've had a refugee health clinic since 2008 in Kitchener, seeing all government-assisted refugees. And so primarily what we did for the first many years was some screening, urgent referrals, and then tried to find them family doctors within a couple of months. And after the Syrian influx at the end of 2015, early 2016, it became increasingly difficult. And so normally we get about 300 people per year in Kitchener-Waterloo. And then we got 857 in the space of 3 months from Syria. And so then it started to become more difficult finding family doctors. And now with COVID, we didn't see a lot of new people for the first part of the year. And now we were seeing that 300 basically in the last 4 months. And on top of that, the Afghan pledge of the government to take now 40,000 people would have meant that we would get about 500 in KW. So we were trying to look at how we were going to meet the needs, and we're expanding with more physicians working other than me, nurse practitioners, RNs, but also trying to figure out about interpretation, figure out about social work with people who are very traumatized. So we've just been meeting more regularly around that, trying to organize a response.
Do you have any of the Afghans yet, or are they mostly going to be trickling in?
Yeah, we have probably 150 or so now, and we haven't seen all of them yet. But at least it's not going to be a flood like with the Syrians. It's a little bit slower, so that's actually good. From the point of view of this conversation, we've also been involved with our Pegasus Institute. We had a webinar last Friday related to Afghans across the country, but so the people that we had were related to safety of people within Afghanistan, getting people out of Afghanistan, and then needs in terms of resettlement and health within Canada.
Today's Globe and Mail has a rather depressing story about one house in Kabul that is full of people who worked for the Canadians. I think 19 people just waiting to be rescued. I don't know whether there's a thing that can be done for them. Do you know anything about how they're trying to get those people out? Those, and of course there are others elsewhere.
Yeah, that's complex. Yeah, some of the people that were involved with our meeting last Friday are people who've been involved in that. But I think that the more you talk about those things, the less effective they are. But we can't really say, like with some people's personal contacts, to keep people safe.
Is there any particular symptomatology that goes with the trauma of being a refugee?
Yeah, I think that so we see a couple of different classes of refugees, or a couple of issues related to location. So the Syrians, the Iraqis before then, the Afghans are people who individually may have experienced very major trauma, witnessed bad things happening to family members and to people close to them. That they may have the physical amputation type things. And then you have people from the Burmese-Thai border, from the Horn of Africa and other parts of Africa who have been in more protracted war situations in refugee camps and may have received poorer health care, start off with poorer health. Now with the Syrian influx, people had often spent months or years outside of Syria in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. And the ones that Canada accepted earlier were people with usually with poorer education and larger families, which represented challenges in terms of integration here. Now with the Afghans, the trauma is very fresh. And with people, as you say, with very specific danger, like not all family members evacuated. So the mental health aspects are probably worse now. But we often see people with many issues. And I know Jonathan in Victoria, I know Victoria has also taken many people that the kids with developmental issues that haven't been looked after. We also find people who have different expectations of the Canadian system, that they think that something that is really incurable, that with some of these developmental issues, that they somehow think that we're going to come up with something that is going to manage issues or reverse.
My work has been more has involved more with children with autism and with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, ADHD. But I just want to expand Neil's comments a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about the importance of providing a safe environment. Because children, certainly from the biology point of view, having a safe place and providing environmental security and safety is really important for developmental, what we call trajectory. Children's developmental progress is certainly can be stymied or impaired by adversity. So stress, for example, and this extends not only to the prenatal period, but throughout their lives. So I'm sure that Neil's seeing that on a regular basis through the supporting refugees. But I do think that it's important. You and I, Meta, have talked in the past about the importance of the environment, the so-called epigenome, the epigenetic environment, factors outside the genome which can impact on the behavior and learning and mental health actually of individuals. So providing that safe place is really important. So yeah, I do think that one of the things I would like to say is the importance of physicians, and I'm wearing a T-shirt, "Physicians for Global Survival," which was a former iteration of our current. The name of our organization now is International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada. But we've evolved our role since our name change. We have expanded purposes. So I just want to comment on that, because the health consequences of violence, armed conflict, which is what Neil's alluding to, nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. So when our organization, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, was established, the primary concern was around nuclear weapons. But now, of course, we realize that physicians in the medical profession have a much broader role in terms of other threats, and of course, armed conflict and violence are some of those factors. And so that's one of the areas that we've been involved with here in Victoria, is going into high schools and speaking with young people in grade 10, grade 11, grade 12. It's quite amazing, because now in our newly 2.0 iteration of IPPNW, we have some young people that we actually met in a local high school here, and one of them is now at McGill and is our executive director, and the other is our program coordinator. And we met them at 17, and now they're amazing young women, and now they're involved with our organization. Mm-hmm. So we see the importance of involving young people and improving awareness. So it's interesting how one small thing can create. You think at the time you're just going into a high school to speak with a peace group of young people, but then it turns out that they've gone on to amazing things. And
Alan, tell us what you folks in Ann Arbor have been up to the last 10 days or so.
Yes, I will. But I was very stimulated by this discussion that made more real than it has been the actual human situation of the people caught up in this global calamity. Mm. It brought to mind my father, who was an economist. He's passed on. And in 1939, he was employed as the head of an organization, the National Refugee Service. And as the Nazis were taking over, there was a group called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that endeavored to get Jews out of Europe to America and to other places. And once they got to America, then there was a National Refugee Service whose task was to find a location for them, employment, education, and deal with their human needs. And this discussion just brought a level of closeness to what he was actually dealing with. I was 3 years old then, and the family was moved to New York City, and did I know what was going on? I considered myself a war refugee, moved from the nice home in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to the big town. And I know that in coming to Ann Arbor, it is in Ann Arbor, the group that is most involved with refugees is the Jewish Family Service, which has taken on responsibility to settle and engage with refugees from various countries. And now there are some people who are from Afghanistan.
Is there a peace community that people who are all in touch with each other, or how do you do your work?
Yeah, Ann Arbor used to be a very strongly organized peace community, and it is now quite fragmented. I could say a little about that. The campaign that I've been involved with in Ann Arbor for since 2009 is the center of the city. The city government very intent on the development, big buildings, build an underground parking structure, and the question is what happens on top. And they wanted to build a sky-rise conference center and then a sky-rise luxury condo. And I've been part of the organization that says the center of the city should be a commons for everyone, a public place, a civic center, a central park. Mass sense that resources should really be in the hands of the people who use them is a slightly foreign idea. So we have been struggling with the powers that be, the mayor, the city council, the library, the Downtown Development Association Authority, the Chamber of Commerce, and finally got the question on the ballot, and we won. We beat all the ruling class elements.
Good. Well, good for you. Hooray.
Then we see, so what do we do on this commons?
Yeah.
And we've been organizing around Earth Day in April and Peace Day in September. And this year we determined every Peace Day, we say every day should be Peace Day. So we say we make a week. So we determined from Sunday, the 19th of September through Saturday, the 25th, we would do Peace Week, and we would have different activities that would try to develop the sense of this is our land, and how do we, develop share our image of what it can be? How do we bring beauty to the land and the images of what we would like to see, considering beauty as a test of truth? And on Peace Day, particularly focused on the UN Resolution 1325, women must be at the peace table. And the next day we had discussions on many questions regarding peace locally and globally. The tar sands pipelines that come through Minnesota and through Michigan in the local sense, and then the war in Yemen and Palestine and Afghanistan, 9/11, and what is going on in the big picture. And the twin terrors of nuclear weapons, as we're 100 seconds before midnight, and the climate calamity is the sense of a 1.5 raise in temperature is an illusion, given the incapacity of the power system actually to rein in the extractive sources. And then we had
I want to go on and talk about something about the IPPNW globally, if you don't mind, Alan.
No.
Because one of the things that since I've got Jonathan and Neil together, and Neil's still muted, I want to ask what is going on with IPPNW as a global institution, because it was begun really as a more or less a contact between Russians and American physicians, but it of course includes others. And I just wonder whether the global international aspect of the organization is still very paramount or even noticeable. How much contact, for example, would you folks with Jonathan and Neil have with any Russian members of IPPNW? Are there any international meetings going on or any real dialogues going on? And if so, do they also, or do the Russian end of things include more diversity of issues? The way you've said that the at least the Canadian group recognizes other health issues and other challenges as part of your mandate, as well as nuclear weapons. Are you, for example, including climate change? And if so, are the Russians including climate change, et cetera? What's going on internationally, if you don't mind, with that organization?
IPPNW began primarily with Soviet and American physicians in 1980. Led by two cardiologists, Bernard Lown and Evgeny Chazov, who were both experts in sudden cardiac death, Bernard Lowen, the inventor of the defibrillator. They were concerned why the two countries, if they were trying to save each other at conferences at an individual level, why that they would be having bombs to eliminate each other at a group level. Won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. Between 1980 and 1985, it became much more of a global movement with people from various countries, primarily from the global north in Europe. And I think Dr. Lowen's vision was initially to stay very focused on nuclear weapons issues. As the organization expanded more globally, some of the affiliates wanted to expand that much more, and later the affiliates in the Global South were interested in landmines, small arms. PSR in the US has taken more of an interest also on gun control. And
that's Physicians for Social Responsibility in the US.
Yes. So PSR has taken an interest in environmental things, including climate change. The Russian affiliate, as far as I know, it's not nearly as active as it used to be, or not with the numbers it had, but does concentrate on nuclear weapons issues still.
Can you tell me how free they are? Let me say that about a year ago, I tried to contact some experts on nuclear weapons in Russia at the various institutes and so on. I just was curious to see what they were thinking about and doing. And I found very, very few people who would say that they actually want nuclear disarmament. They talk about arms control, resuming the boldest demand they would have would say we should really get back into arms control talks more than before. But I almost got the feeling that if an expert were to really say anything critical of the current Russian policy, there would be repercussions. Now, what that makes me wonder is whether that affects IPPNW as far as, the physicians in Russia. Are they limited, or do they feel constrained about saying anything critical about the Soviet or the Russian nuclear weapon policy?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's hard to read the minds of people. But we also have to think that people's orientation may be more that way. So it may not be the external constraints, that they may not. Mm-hmm. A lot of people from the rest of the world view our way of doing things within our peace movement of being a bit colonized, I would say. So when we're looking at decolonization and global health, I think we also have to think about our perspectives within the peace sector. And so, for instance, I'll just expand that further, that say, when we look at Indian nuclear weapons, that we're all saying, yeah, it's terrible that India has nuclear weapons, and we're all agreed that India shouldn't have it and other countries shouldn't have it. But then India, and most Indians will say, well, India doesn't, they've said very explicitly that they would not have a first strike policy. Meanwhile, we're in a country under a nuclear umbrella that doesn't even state that. And then in terms of saying that some countries have a right to nuclear weapons, or we're going to work hard against countries with nuclear weapons, like again, with Israel's nuclear weapons, they seem more benign to people in the West than North Korea's or Iran possibly getting them. And so I think that that's a perspective that's shared in the Global South, but in Russia, they also will have similar things where they will say, we don't need to get our house in order as much as you need to.
Yeah, I just add to that as well. In terms of the role of the, for want of a better term, the mothership IPPNW. There are national affiliates, of which our organization is the Canadian affiliate, but each affiliate decides how they want to focus their activities in energy, recognizing that the issue of nuclear weapons has fallen off a lot of individuals' radar since 1989. And I must confess, personally, I felt that when the wall came down, and then subsequently in 91, when the Soviet Union dissolved, there was going to be, at the time, it was called the peace dividend, that the funds that were used to maintain the cold hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States, they would be used for better purposes. And looking back, it was unfortunate that there was a missed opportunity. But each national affiliate of IPPNW decides how they want to focus. So we've expanded here in Canada our focus, our purposes, as they're called, to include, for example, I've mentioned violence and armed conflict, but we've also included energy resources. For example, small modular nuclear reactors, which the Canadian government is now proposing to use and develop, even though there's no business case and there's certainly no energy case for proposing that. So the United Kingdom, for example, their organization is called MEDACT, and they are the UK affiliate of IPPNW. They have a much broader base. They have a much wider mandate, and they've got subgroups, for example, Doctors Against Diesel, for example. So, and I see it as being like a lobby. You come in with a specific interest, and then you realize that all of these issues are interconnected. If they're not separate, that it is. As a developmental pediatrician, it's like the mobile that hangs above your baby's crib. You move one part and everything changes. So I think that everything, until there is a new sort of balance, but I do think that each individual affiliate decides for itself. Now, we've had a speaker from Kazakhstan. As you know, Kazakhstan was the country that tested the majority of the Soviet nuclear weapons. And we had Dr. Casanova. We have regular connections around the world, actually. We have monthly invited guest speakers from around the world, from Australia to Kazakhstan to UK. And so we have that connectivity.
I'm sorry, excuse me. You're having monthly meetings with speakers that I didn't know about?
Yeah, the third Wednesday of every month, we have an active members group, and we invite speakers from, I've mentioned Dr. Casanova, who's she spoke to us from the capital of Kazakhstan, and we are. Tilman Ruff spoke to us from Australia. We've had individuals, so and that engages our membership. And our active members.
I've got to know more about it. Maybe I even have to rejoin IPPNW Canada in order to sit in on one of these sessions.
You would be most welcome to join Meta. One other thing I would like to say is that IPPNW was the driving force behind the international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. That was the civil society organization which pulled together the humanitarian imperative, as it's called, for the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That was that driver, that initiative, actually, and the funding to a certain extent came from IPPNW, and that started back in 2007. Gorbachev, when he was speaking about factors or influences, as they're called, on his worldview around nuclear weapons, he said there were two major factors, influences. Number one was meeting physicians from both the United States and for the Soviet Union, talking about the health consequences of nuclear weapons. And number two was receiving letters from children from around the world calling for him and Reagan to actually in the end they entered into the INF treaty. But nevertheless, so physicians have a role, and certainly young people have a role, and that's where our focus is within IPPNW Canada. Engagement with young people, which is why we've been going into high schools, why we now have a youth group, for example, within IPPNW Canada. And so I think it's physicians have a voice, and people do listen to what we have to say. With some healthy skepticism, of course, and we would encourage that, but nevertheless, we do an important role as members of civil society.
Well, not only that, but your role with promoting ICANN in Canada was quite wonderful. And I just wonder whether the physicians' movements in other countries, IPPNW groups in other countries, were as involved with ICANN as you are. And I don't know whether Alan knows. Alan, are you in touch with Physicians for Social Responsibility in the US? And do you know how active they are and whether they have been very instrumental with the ICANN movement and the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty?
I'm less involved with Physicians for Social Responsibility, but very involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was the driving force in the United States. And Susie Snyder, who came from WILF, was very active in the international negotiations for the treaty for the prohibition. And there is some debate, tension, I would say, in the anti-nuclear movement between trying to maintain a focus on the Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that the nuclear states have agreed to take decisive action to the elimination of nuclear weapons, to continue that focus, and the Prohibition Treaty, which is now entered into force, and to go after those corporations that are still in the 26 corporations in the United States that some way or another are involved in the production of nuclear weapons that are now, in terms of international law, doing illegal activity. So this is a debate of emphasis within the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, particularly in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Now, are you saying that there's no consensus that the whole peace movement in the U.S. wants to support the TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons?
Everybody wants to support everything, but in what do we actually press for? There seems to be different emphases. And I'm most interested myself in the illegality of the engagement of corporations in the production of any aspect of the nuclear system, because that allows educationally people to see that this is not some abstraction, but is the particular activities of particular corporations that add this, that, or the other part to the entire complex that produces this devastating potential. And we've also been very active in the Cities for Peace coming from Hiroshima to see each city government should have a view toward the pressing the United States government to adopt embrace the international prohibition and put that onto a local governmental level. Our city government has been resistant and says, well, we just deal with local questions. But
well, right now, there may be a moment when there's a little bit of opportunity for some change in the US, in that there's a nuclear policy review going on. They do it habitually every so often, but with Biden, he had said that he was in favor of, well, it's not called no first use, it's called sole purpose. But it's basically the same as the question of whether the US would declare its policy to be one of no first use of nuclear weapons. And he's in favor of that. He said so before he became president. But as I understand it, there's a problem going on right now as the person that he appointed to represent his views in the Pentagon on this policy review thing has been squeezed out. She's been thrown out of her role, and it looks as if the Hawks are gaining the upper hand in this nuclear policy review process, which would mean probably Biden may not be able to go right ahead and declare what he wanted to. Whether you know anything about that, or either Jonathan or Neil know anything about the prospects for getting no first use, I think that the most hopeful thing we could have would be a change in the U.S. policy, at least on that issue, although it's a long way from getting the U.S. to actually sign the treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment on that. Obviously, the end game, or as Martin Luther King would say, the prize at the end of the rainbow is the total elimination of nuclear weapons. But the reality is that's going to take a long time. And so in the meantime, one of the NFU, or no first use, or sole purpose as it's called, of nuclear weapons is part of the risk reduction strategy. And there's some debate, which I think was what we're talking a little bit about here. In other words, ways in which we could reduce the risk of a nuclear explosion. And so one of those mechanisms, and in fact, the PSR in the United States has a policy around back from the brink. And there are various pillars to that back from the brink, taking us, in other words, confidence building measures, for example, which is something that you just alluded to. During the early days of IPPNW, there was a lot of connection and collaboration between physicians from the USSR and the United States. Until fairly recently, having direct communications between Russia and the United States was not on the agenda. It was I think risk reduction is one thing. The other part of this story, which is again the health consequences of nuclear weapons, it's to me it's absolutely gobsmacking that the fact that the blast effects of a nuclear explosion were the primary measurement or metric of their utility. No one really, until recently, considered the effect of soot being lofted up into the atmosphere until, nuclear winter. We've known about that, but one of the studies that has come out, again, IPPNW were very involved in this work, was a limited nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, where 100 nuclear weapons would be used either side, and the impact on the climate. It turns out that analysis has never been undertaken. However, next year in the United States, the Pentagon is to report, my understanding, and correct me on this one, Alan, the details, but there will be a report to Congress on what is the impact of changes within the stratosphere from millions of tons of soot lofted into the stratosphere, and how does that figure into the calculus? And the blast effects were an easy metric because TNT, for example, 12,000 tons was a Hiroshima yield, as it were, but no one ever considered the fires and the lofting of soot into the atmosphere.
In terms of physicians and how engaged they are in other countries with this, yes, very much so. So there's Ron McCoy from Malaysia, who is considered the father of the idea of ICANN. And then the Australian affiliate of IPPNW, MAPW, including Tillman Ruff, took that upon themselves to lead in getting funding for that. And so many of the ICANN national movements have a lot of physicians as part of that. And so that continues to be that way. And also involving other medical bodies like the World Health Organization and the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. They've been very supportive of this. So the health message is important. With regard to the US policies, something we were asking for 20, 30 years ago was even just de-alerting or no launch on warning. that when we realize that we've got all these weapons targeted, even if we look at Russia or China, that how much of an acute enemy are these? And even the US is not willing to say that, no, this isn't necessary, that we need to have these things so we can launch within 15 minutes. In terms of the Biden administration and how sincere they were, I'm not so sure that they were. Obama was actually much more that way prior to 2008. If you see some of his speeches, he seemed knowledgeable on the issue in terms of actual getting down closer to zero. And then when he came to power, he certainly didn't move that way. And I haven't seen that from Biden. But there were a couple of other strands I hope we can get to later. With Jonathan, I wondered when he was talking about childhood development, whether he might talk about IPPNW Canada's Peaceful Childhoods program, where people like Joanna Santa Barbara led things in terms of trying to create that. With Alan, I like having just seen the film, the Chicago 7, of course, I just wondered what he thought of the film and what he thought of that. I'm just so impressed to see somebody who's been active in the peace movement for more than half a century and interested in his evolution of thinking. So I hope we can get to those things too during this conversation, Meta.
Proceed.
I'm happy to continue to schmooze. I'll pass on the Chicago 7. It was very beneficial, I think, to a contemporary audience to see that there was this struggle going on. As to factual history and accurate representation of any of the parties in that, a very poor film. But I did want to say my impression is that the Pentagon and the War Party is clearly in charge of the US government. Biden can have whatever views he wants, but they are incidental to what the generals have in mind, and they are very confrontational. And that has been at least the case since the Bush people took over in 2000 and 2001. And I want to just put this pebble in the pond. When I went my first trip to Israel in 1974, I was given a tour by a soldier into the Golan Heights who had been in the campaign in 1973. And he took me first to the headwaters of the Jordan River, that is like the Garden of Eden, just beautiful, where the waters come out of the earth and it is luxurious. And he told me that we have the bomb. Anybody who messes with us, we will use it with no doubt in our minds. And we will have no interest in relinquishing that capacity, even if we take the Samson option, where everything comes down around us. And the development of the project for the New American Century that was in the Bush, before the Bush administration during Carter time, was very much oriented to how to limit the capacity of the Arab regimes in the Middle East that could threaten the security of Israel. And that has been the initiating of the new Pearl Harbor that has brought on these various wars in the Middle East. And the protective role of the Pentagon for the Israeli government, and no talk whatsoever about Israeli denuclearization at all, not on the table, not even considered, not even relevant. And yet it is a fundamental factor. And when I mentioned earlier, maybe before the conversation got together, that the peace movement in Ann Arbor is very divided, because there are those who are critical of the Israeli policy toward Palestine, and there are those who don't want to say anything about the role of, quote, Jewish power in local or United States politics. And anyone criticizing the role of the Jewish Israeli government is essentially put out of the political respectability. And that has divided the peace movement in Ann Arbor or the social action movement, so that conversation is internally constrained. There are things that if you talk about, you are persona non grata.
Mhm.
When I would say I'm somewhat in that category and among some people, but it is what used to be the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice, which was the forefront organization against nuclear weapons, does not deal anything with international questions anymore. It's a very sad situation, and it is an undercurrent in the problems of getting any unity about nuclear disarmament, because eventually you got to talk about Israel, and you can't talk about Israel in the United States. So that's a little pebble in the pond, and all the efforts toward the Treaty on Prohibition, very essential. The discussion about the actual environmental effects, what was said about, if Pakistan and India do a little exchange, that's devastating for the whole world. Will initiate the nuclear winter. And somehow all these questions have to be brought together to say no, 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 but it's very, very difficult. That's what we tried to do in our Peace Week a little bit. We made some progress, but it's very hard to get people to come out in an open discussion, because eventually it comes up against the protection of Israel against those who would want rights for Palestine.
Well, you're touching on an issue that I think is not just local in the U.S. It is in Canada. It is elsewhere. Yesterday, I did an interview with Ed Broadbent, who had been the leader of the NDP, the Social Democratic Party in Canada. He's been out of office a number of years now, but he's still very influential. He runs this thing called the Broadbent Institute. So he had been the head of an institute that had been funded and initiated by all parties in the Canadian government and funded by the Canadian government. It was called Rights and Democracy. And he pointed out that when I pressed him to, that the reason it had been shut down by Harper some years ago was because of the exact question that you mentioned. Any criticism of Israeli policy was unacceptable, and so the Harper shut it down. So that's not only true, that was a decade or more ago, but it was also true more recently, I believe, in England, when the question of Corbyn was, as the Labour Party leader, they were criticized for not taking a stand against an anti-Semitic statement. Now, what that statement was, I don't know, whether it was real anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli policy, because usually if you you say anything critical about Israeli military or in foreign affairs policy, it's called anti-Semitism, which is, I think, not a fair way of looking at it. And just now in Canada, we had the breakup basically of the Green Party. It's in bad shape because of the recent election, when the leader of the party did not do anything against one of her aides who apparently made anti-Semitic statements. So I guess the question is, any criticism of, say, Israel's nuclear weapons gets branded anti-Semitism. And then, but there really is anti-Semitism in the world. Yeah. So it just should not be conflated. The acceptance that of the equation that criticizing Israel is the same as anti-Semitism is, I think, a very bad precedent. We have to combat that, because otherwise you can't deal with the real issues that need to be addressed. We
were privileged to have 3 hours with Joanna Santa Barbara, who was speaking from her home in New Zealand on last Saturday, when she participated in a workshop that we had, a virtual workshop, of course, and so I think it was really important to hear her voice because New Zealand, as you know, has a strong history of work that led to it declaring itself a nuclear weapons-free country. And with the recent announcement around a partnership between Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States, AUKUS as it's called, AUKUS, where Australia will be acquiring nuclear submarines. And in fact, there's some debate about whether that has how that runs against the NPT, provisions of the NPT. But anyway, that aside, I do feel that we need to be thinking about the role of, it's very easy to get drawn into partisan political discussion. And I think that we need to, as health professionals, we need to stay as much as we can away from partisan discussions. We need to bring a health lens. It's the humanitarian and health consequences that we are primarily concerned with, whether it's with nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, armed conflict. And I think that's where our strength lies as an organization, not only here in Canada, but also around the world. That the health consequences are what we are primarily concerned with. And I think we, you know, there are a lot of things vying for our attention right now. Whether it's COVID or climate or the post-antibiotic era, as it's called, or AI or emerging technologies. And I think that, of course, we need to consider all of these emerging issues, but at the same time, I think that what we bring to the table is the health impact, because that's what people are wanting to hear from us as participating as civil society. What are the health impacts? And I think that's a really important. We need to maintain our focus on the health consequences without being diverted. And I think, unfortunately,
take this AUKUS thing.
Yeah.
Ugly name, but there you go. Are there any foreseeable health consequences of that? I don't see that. That's really, it's a pawn in the whole geostrategic game that they're playing. Who's going to dominate the South China Sea, for one thing?
Right.
So if you focus just on health consequences, I don't know what there is to be said about that pact.
Well,
the Marshall Islands are bringing legal action to get reparations in some sort for the health consequences of the nuclear testing, and in some way to materialize these health consequences of the past makes this question a little more salient in the present. So I think that effort is very positive and should be amplified.
Okay. Neil, what's your view? In fact, I'll give you the last word because we got to wind up.
You'd like me to address Israel-Palestine and
whatever.
Okay. Well, I've been engaged in the region for the last 20 years. Was involved in a study of mental health of Palestinian adolescents in 2002. My cousin studied in Israel in West Jerusalem. I was at the Jewish General for my residency in Montreal. So I am engaged here. And so the larger point of whether there are different standards in North America for Israel as other countries, certainly I think there are. And it's tough that affects a lot of civil discourse within peace movements, as you've said, as well as without. With Britain, with Corbyn's the tax on his leadership, yes, I think that people used this. There is a strand of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party in Britain that had to be dealt with, but the whole thing about the definition of anti-Semitism, which he was criticized for not supporting the additional protocols of that definition. it was a little bit rich, and I see that within the Labour Party today, they're still having that particular discussion, unfortunately, so I'm sorry to see that happening within the Green Party in Canada. Too, as you say, we actually were going to look at bringing Gazan children to Canada for medical treatment, and looked at support from all of the parties, but it was a little bit difficult with that. I was working with Iseline Abu-Aleish, a Gazan origin physician who lost 3 daughters and a niece in the 2009 Operation Cast Lead. But we were just looking at bringing people for treatment. But of course, even something humanitarian like that becomes political. Mm-hmm. And the Green Party was actually, the parliamentary caucus wanted to work on that with us, but for many reasons they got waylaid. So yeah, I guess to try to have the conclusion remark, even when we try to engage in things which are entirely health or non-political, the politics does end up coming to bear. And it's a little bit like Virchow said, and something I've used in some of my writing, that Politik ist weiter nichts als Medizin in Großen. That politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. So in many ways, we end up having to look at the intersection of the two, and those of us who are interested in social determinants of health do combine the two.
Well, you have my blessings. Thank you very much, all three of you. It's been fascinating. I think we could, this is only scratching the surface of the conversation we could have if we had another couple of hours, but we're over. Thank you very, very much. Take care. Bye now.
A pleasure to schmooze with you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, schmooze for democratic society.